Hi, this is Josh Braun with Life Report, responding to another piece of listener mail. This is an email from Valerie in Silver Lake, Kansas. I'm actually going to make this into 3 separate videos. There's a lot here that I think is worth talking about and could be helpful to you as you're talking to pro-choice people. She gives a couple of specific examples of things that this person said. It's actually her dad, and it just responding to all of it, even semi-thoroughly would have made a long video. So I'm gonna kind of do a general one here. I'm gonna respond to a few things as he's setting up the story, and then I'll do a couple of videos that get more specific to a few of the things her dad said. But this is what Valerie says as he's telling the story, and I'm gonna have a few comments as I read it. So he says, I just finished up a discussion with my dad that was prompted by my sharing of the meme with the quote from Christopher Hitchen on Facebook. In case you didn't know, Christopher Hitchens, very famous atheist, kind of one of the leaders of the so-called new atheists, kind of anti-theists, who recently and tragically died from cancer. He was a very famous debater, very, very witty, and debated Christians a lot. I don't think we should say Christopher Hitchens was pro-life, although he said a few things. There's a few quotes out there that make it sound like he was pro-life. He wasn't pro-life in the sense, like usually when pro-life people, if they would say, if you're only pro-life if you think abortion should at least generally be illegal. And that was not Hitchens' view. Hitchens' view was that Roe versus Wade should stay. But he did have some interesting things to say about what is the unborn. And it seems like he thought, at the very least, it wasn't part of a woman's body, and that we should be spending more time talking about fetal personhood. And so he said some things that kind of sound pro-life, and it's interesting. And so pro-life people have made memes with quotes from him and put them on Facebook. Anyway, that's what Valerie's referring to. So he goes on to say, he is pro-choice, and we have had some short discussions, but this was by far the longest dialogue we had had. In this dialogue, he stuck to his strong belief that the fetus is not a human being. Now pause. I know I said this before, but just in case, remember, whenever someone who is pro-choice says they don't think the fetus is a human being, you need to ask a clarification question. Do you mean that you don't think it's biologically a human being? Meaning, do you believe that the fetus is not a member of the species Homo sapiens? Like its DNA is not human? Usually that's not what the person means. Usually it means something more philosophical. I don't think it's a valuable human. It's not a person or whatever. And that's where most pro-choice people are at least partially. But it's important to know where they're going with this. Or do they believe neither? It's neither biologically human or philosophically valuable. You just want to ask that clarification question. Valerie says, now, my dad is a Christian. So I eventually did ask him about what he thought God thinks about the unborn. It's a great question. I've got some thoughts about that. And Valerie says, but I didn't start with that. It's probably wise. So he says, I tried using the 10-second pro-life apologist. That's something that Steve Wagner teaches at Justice for All. Basically, just in 10 seconds, this kind of sums up your pro-life views. We know that the unborn are alive because they're growing. We know the unborn are human because they have human parents. And I think human beings like you and me are valuable. What about you? That's basically what he's saying. So he started with a 10-second pro-life apologist, and he disagreed that a fetus is human. And then he says something really interesting. He wouldn't answer our questions directly. Why not? That would be something I would want to ask in that discussion. This happens all the time, and pro-life people probably do it sometimes too. I won't say probably. Everyone does this sometimes. You don't maybe want to stick with, maybe answering the person's questions that they're asking you. But it seems like it seems like the question of what does God think about the unborn is a really important question for an atheist. I'm sorry, for a Christian. He's a Christian. So an atheist isn't going to care. But for a Christian, even if you don't think the fetus is a person, it seems like God does, or maybe there's a biblical argument for caring for the unborn, caring about the unborn, seems like that would be really relevant, right? So, I would probably try a couple of times to get them to answer that question, and why don't you want to answer it? Now, the way to do that can be tricky, because you don't want to offend the person, you don't want to make them mad unnecessarily, and so here is where I think it's really important to do something that Greg Koukl, at Stand to Reason, calls narrating the debate. I think he's the one. I know Scott Klusendorf has used that term too, and I'm sure they're probably not the first. But anyway, that just means kind of pausing the debate, kind of sort of stepping outside of it and describing or narrating what you see going on, helping them see what you see. So I might say, hold on, I'm confused here. It seems like I'm answering your questions. I'm not just trying to make you bear all the burden of proof here. I'm giving you straight answers, but it feels like I've asked you a couple of questions that are really important to help me understand where you're coming from, and it seems like you keep on kind of jumping to maybe asking me more questions. I really want to understand where you're coming from. I don't want to just lump you in with all pro-choice people, because pro-choice people don't all have the same views. So some people think that the unborn is a person, but or they don't care because of bodily rights. Bodily rights itself trumps the unborn's right to live, so it doesn't matter. Some pro-choice people disagree. They think that the unborn is not a person, so why should this matter? It's more like having a mole removed. Some people don't even think it's biologically human. Some people think it's all about privacy or what the government should and should not, declare about whatever. Help me understand where you're coming from, especially as a Christian. That's kind of how I would do that. I wouldn't do like this. Hey, you won't answer any of my questions. Just pause and just they might not realize what they're doing. And sometimes people get into debate mode, and they just want to fire off questions or maybe keep you on the defensive, or it maybe it's something that's happening subconsciously. So I think narrating the debate can be really, really helpful to help people understand what you're seeing. And if you have a reasonable request, like, could you answer a couple of my questions, please? That's reasonable. That can help you move on. Valerie goes on to say, I would be interested in hearing any advice for how to challenge somebody who doesn't view the fetus as a human being. I thought of the Polaroid film analogy, but wasn't sure enough about it to use it. I'm going to explain about what she's talking about there in one of the next two videos, because it actually does come up a place where she could talk about the Polaroid film thing. It goes back to an argument that Richard Stith has made. I'm going to explain what that argument is and how she could have used it, but I'm just not going to do that here because it's not as relevant to this part of the email. She says, Dad has also thrown out an argument that the functional DNA is different at the earlier stages of development than later. And I never got a chance for him to explain what he meant by that, but I didn't know if you had ever heard of that. Once again, this is like, if someone makes an argument, and I'm not reading every single part of the email, but he has a background in biology. So it seems like he would mean something specific when he says something about functional DNA. If you're making an argument, something you think is a strong pro-choice argument, why wouldn't you help the person you're arguing with understand your great argument when they ask for clarification? I don't understand. Reverse it. Let's say I was making a really strong response to bodily rights arguments. And bodily rights arguments are more sophisticated usually than personhood type arguments, I think. Unless you're talking about kind of advanced threshold arguments, and we're going to talk about those on Life Report one day in the future, but not right now. Bodily rights arguments can be kind of sophisticated or tricky, and so if I'm trying to give what I feel like is a sophisticated response, but I'm trying to do it quickly and maybe oversimplify it, if the pro-choice person says, okay, I'm trying to follow where you're going, but I don't understand exactly what you're saying. Can you flesh this out for me? I'm happy to do that. I'm going to be, let me take a little bit more time and explain a little bit more. And I can do that. I've thought about this. It's easier to do an hour on this stuff than a 10, 15-second soundbite. So, and sometimes the soundbite is much more helpful to the other person. But if they're wanting to follow and just want me to go ahead and take another 60 seconds and flesh this out for me, I'm totally going to do it. So I'm wondering, what would be the motivation of a pro-choice Christian who makes a specific argument about what the unborn is, or maybe why he thinks it's not human because of this DNA thing that he thinks is different at the earlier stages than later, and you're asked, what do you mean by that, to not answer it, that probably says something bad about what your motivation is for this dialogue, and that's not the only reason I think that we're gonna get there. Just to answer the question, I haven't heard of that. Some people talk about, this has been more common recently, about the way that the mother's body is interacting with the unborn at the very, very early stages, has to do with the mother's RNA, that maybe that means that the unborn is not its own kind of individual entity. Trent Horn responded to that argument on an episode of Life Report. I'll link to it in the description. I'm not going to rehash that here. I would say, even if, I'm not sure what it would mean for the unborn to have a less functional DNA or different DNA. If it was different DNA, that would be interesting. But I'm not even sure then it would be morally relevant, because my argument for the humanity of the unborn is not completely grounded in what the unborn's DNA is. That's going to be one of my arguments for why the unborn is biologically human. I'm going to say, it's true. If you took a blood sample from an unborn fetus, and you could do this, you could go in and withdraw blood. We just usually don't. But you could test it, and you could see a distinct human DNA fingerprint. If you put it in one of those tests that you see on CSI or whatever, you can tell species and more by examining the DNA. And so, yeah, if it is completely non-human DNA that becomes human, let's say right at the second trimester, that would be really interesting and maybe worth discussing. But I think that's not what's going on here. I think probably what he means is that the DNA maybe acts or functions differently in the beginning and then later on. I'm not sure if that's even true, but even if it is, I'm not sure that's going to be morally relevant. So anyway, yeah, there's not much I can do to respond to that without knowing more, and unfortunately your dad didn't respond. So anyway, that's kind of an introduction, and the next two videos, some of the things I'm going to respond to, because what Valerie did was send a couple of quotes from him so I could get kind of more specific and respond specifically to where her dad's coming from. We're going to be talking about some of his arguments that the unborn is both not biologically human or philosophically valuable. And also in the third video, we're going to talk about what do you do when someone actually states that their mind is made up on an issue that you're debating. What do you do then when they say, I'm completely closed-minded, you're not going to change my mind? What should you do then? This has happened to me. So we'll talk about that in a future video. Thanks for watching.